I took the apartment because it was cheap. Not the kind of cheap you brag about. The kind of cheap you don't tell people about unless they ask directly. The listing was short. No photos of the hallway. No mention of neighbors. Just the square footage, the price, and one line at the bottom that stayed with me longer than it should have. Ideal for single occupancy. At the time, I read that as reassurance. I didn't realize it was a condition. The building was on a street I walked past almost every day. I'd never noticed it before, even though it had clearly been there longer than most of the shops around it. 4 floors, brick exterior, no sign out front, no name. The front door opened with a key instead of a buzzer. It felt heavier than it looked. When it closed behind me, the sound didn't echo the way I expected it to. It was dull, absorbed. Inside, there was no reception desk, no security, just a narrow lobby and a staircase that led upward, disappearing after the first turn. I stood there for a moment, waiting for someone to acknowledge me. No one did. My apartment was on the 3rd floor. The hallway smelled faintly of cleaning solution, but underneath that was something older. Dry, flat. My door resisted when I tried to open it. Not locked, just reluctant. The air inside felt contained, as if it hadn't mixed with the rest of the building yet. The apartment itself was small, but not cramped. Clean, but not cared for. A bed, a table, 1 chair, nothing else. I unpacked quickly. I didn't have much. Clothes, toiletries, my laptop. I set my phone down on the table and noticed there were no mirrors anywhere in the apartment. Not in the bathroom, not in the bedroom. I told myself one had probably broken. That night, I slept poorly. I don't remember falling asleep. I only remember waking suddenly, fully alert, with the sense that something had shifted while I wasn't paying attention. The room looked the same. The next morning, I found a piece of paper taped to the inside of my front door. It was placed carefully at eye level. The tape was pressed flat. No wrinkles, no signs it had been removed and replaced. I was sure it hadn't been there the night before. The paper was blank except for handwriting. Neat, measured, as if whoever wrote it wanted to be understood clearly. At the top, it read, "Tenant Guidelines." I hesitated before reading further. I don't know why. There's nothing threatening about it. Just rules. 1. Do not open the door between 2:17 a.m. and 3:33 a.m. 2. If you hear movement in the hallway during that time, remain inside. 3. If someone knocks, do not respond. 4. If the lights flicker, sit down. 5. Do not attempt to leave the building during the blackout. I went through the list twice. Then I went back to the first rule. I waited for an explanation that never came. There was no signature, no logo, no contact number. I laughed once. The sound felt out of place in the apartment, like it didn't belong there, so I stopped. I told myself it was a joke. Something left behind by a previous tenant who thought this was funny. Still, I didn't throw it away. I folded the paper and placed it on the table. The next 2 days passed without incident. I worked. I cooked simple meals. I unpacked the rest of my things. The apartment stayed quiet. Too quiet. I realized at some point that I hadn't heard a single door open or close since moving in. Not above me, not below me, not beside me. I stood in the middle of the room, listening. Nothing. After a while, my ears began to ring. Not loudly, just enough to remind me that something should have been there. On the third night, I woke up at 2:16 a.m. No alarm, no dream. I opened my eyes already tense, as if my body had reacted before my thoughts caught up. The apartment was dark except for the faint glow of my phone on the table. 2:16 a.m., I remembered the paper. I told myself it didn't mean anything. People wake up at strange times. Old buildings have unstable wiring. Coincidences happen. At 2:17 a.m., the lights dimmed. Not completely, just enough to notice. I didn't move. The room felt smaller, as if the walls had shifted inward without actually changing position. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the door. Nothing else happened. At 3:33 a.m., I realized my hands were shaking. The next morning, I tried to leave the building. The front door wouldn't open, not locked, not jammed. It simply refused to move, as if something solid was pressed against it from the other side. I stepped back and tried again. On the third attempt, the door opened easily. Outside, the noise of the street felt overwhelming. Cars, voices, movement. I stood there longer than necessary, letting it wash over me. When I returned that evening, the paper was back on my door, in the same place. I knew I hadn't put it there. This time, there was an additional line at the bottom. The handwriting was the same, but the letters pressed harder into the page. Do not acknowledge the other tenant. I stared at that sentence until the words lost their shape. The other tenant. I hadn't seen anyone since moving in. No neighbors, no sounds, no signs of life. I opened my door and stepped into the hallway. There were 3 doors, mine and 2 others. Between them was a section of wall where a door frame should have been. The paint there was uneven, darker than the rest, as if something had been removed and covered up without much care. I touched the wall. It was colder than everything around it. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the bed with my phone in my hand, watching the time approach 2:17. At 2:16, the apartment felt alert. At 2:17, the lights flickered. At 2:18, I heard something in the hallway. It wasn't footsteps. It was slower, uneven, like something brushing along the wall as it moved. I stayed exactly where I was. The sound stopped outside my door. There was no knock, just the certainty that whatever stood there knew exactly where I was sitting. The handle turned. I didn't move. At 3:33 a.m., the pressure lifted. The hallway returned to silence. In the morning, the paper was still on my door. Beneath the rules, a final sentence had been added, written smaller than the rest. It's easier if you pretend you're alone. I sat on the floor for a long time after reading that, because something finally became clear. The apartment had never felt empty. It had felt occupied, and whatever lived here hadn't arrived after me. It had been waiting for me to notice.